Tyranids is a perfect example of this. People just are saying that Tyranids are woefully bad.
Webway has finally brought you here. Behold, Forge the Narrative.
Hey everybody, welcome to Forge the Narrative. My name is Paul Murphy, your host. We are the Bell Lost Souls podcast, joined by Adam Camilleri.
Howdy, everybody.
Tanya Gates.
Hey everybody.
And Red Powell. Red's back. Yay.
Hey, what up? It's good to be back.
I don't have a soundboard, so I can't
Adam.
make
Brr, brr,
noises
brr,
or anything.
brr.
Oh, welcome back.
We should, at all times, we should have a soundboard with just a myriad of different clips from the Lord of the Rings lined up. Like, we should just play the Return of the King theme, like when Red comes back from a week or two off.
And all of a sudden, this episode is like $1 million to make.
Yes. Got copyright claims coming in thick and thin. Yeah.
We have to license that music.
I'm sure New Line would just let us have it, right? We're just that big a deal.
We're tight with New Line, of course.
Yeah.
I know what's up. Well, on this show, I thought it might be kind of cool to almost like go back to the fundamentals a little bit and talk about playing the primary missions. With now this faction, Leagues of Votan, they're going to be coming into the ecosystem. It's got some folks, concerned, and I know the level of concern is different for different people, but you gotta, like, if you're going to be playing games in that competitive environment, which I'd also like to point out on the last episode, we talked about how to play games not in the environment, games where you can actually have that. I think they kind of refer to as like the rule zero conversation, if you want. And what that means is you kind of get to define how you're going to interact in your entertainment when you have these discussions with your opponent.
It's a very good way of saying it. And building off what we said last week, when there's a factor in the meta or in the competitive game or whatever level you're playing at, that makes you have to reevaluate how you play and what you do, it's always great to go back to the fundamentals. The things that you can control. You can't control what your opponent brings. You can't control how they play, how they move, what they target, etc., etc. What you can control is, what secondaries you pick, how you deploy, what factors you bring in your list, etc., etc. So it's always good to just take a step back and look at the things that are within your spheres of influence.
Yeah, and we're talking about now is, that what you just mentioned, kind of going into a tournament or a, just a pickup game or whatever of someone that you have not had a conversation with. There are ways to really mitigate that experience. And we talked with Scary at the end of the last show about Crusade. And I'm not saying go play Crusade or a totally different, point value or, game open play or whatever. I'm talking about that kind of stuff. But if you are playing anything outside of a structured event, you can have a conversation with whoever you're playing with and kind of define what those rules of engagement for that period, whatever those O's of the moment are.
Ooh, I like what you did there.
Yeah, I like that.
Took me a second to land on it, but, nailed it there. But, what I'm saying? You get to have that conversation. But, push all that aside. You are in control of your own destiny as far as that goes. But let's talk about when you're not, which is the most fun thing, the thing that we spend most of the time talking about, that the internet seems to spend most of the time talking about, is how on earth am I going to win this tournament game? And I kind of want to talk about, again, just the things that, Adam, you were talking about there, is what can you control and how you may approach a 5 objective versus 6 objective, versus, different win conditions in a game and whatever. Like, taking us back to that fundamental, because you're going to need every point you can get when you're fighting an army that you feel outmatched by, outlisted by, outstatted by.
Yeah, exactly right. And the first things, I suppose, when you're evaluating the situation is you look at what your opponent is preventing you from doing, or the ways in which they're preventing you from playing or winning a game. And the game of 40k, especially now that we have a pretty homogenous mission structure, it's pretty much exactly the same. You have the primary, you have the secondaries. And to my mind, 100% that could be added upon by anybody on this panel or anybody at home, there's 3 main ways to engage your opponent and the game of 40k. It's kind of not in some ways you can look at a game of 40k as it's not you versus your opponent, it's you and your opponent versus the scoreboard, almost racing to see who can get to the highest tally on the scoreboard. And that is certainly one way to play 40k. In fact, that's the way that Necrons are playing 40k right now at the top level. They are literally just racing you to 100 points, and if they get there first, well, if I've scored 100, you probably can't score 100, and therefore I just win. So there's very defined ways to win a game. Now, to my mind, it comes in three flavors, specific flavors. There is the game of removing your opponent's assets. Therefore, whatever score they were going to get doesn't matter because they're just tabled. And that's just, it's like the Alpha Strike, Beta Strike. Just remove them, kill them, stat check them out of the game. And then there is either winning via the primary or winning via the secondary, or a conglomerate of all three, which those are the three distinct ways that I conjure up when I'm looking across at an opponent's army. Which of those three flavors am I going to wield to the best ability to win this game of 40k?
Oh man, that sounds really good, Adam. I'm really sorry I've missed these last couple of weeks, so I couldn't jump in and say things like what I'm about to say.
Jump in.
But you know what I think you need, Adam, for all that
What?
you just said? It's really great. It's good, right? I mean, every mission is what we call MET-TC dependent, right? Your mission, your enemy, the terrain, the timing, it all plays into this, right? Circumstances and everything from there. But I just think you need a lot of luck, Adam. That's
I was
all.
hanging actually on the edge of my seat here. Is he going to tell us what the C
No.
means?
That's but yeah, so with luck, Adam, because you know what luck really is, right?
Tell us, Red. Enlighten us.
Anyone? Bueller? No? Adam, come on, man. I thought you were all over this. Luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity, right?
Mhm.
And I can't take credit for that. That's like Seneca, the Roman philosopher.
Yep.
And so, but all that to say, and excuse my facetiousness, I needed to just get that one out. But absolutely to what you're talking about in regards of there's a mastery of the fundamentals that plays right into it. And those fundamentals, and Paul, where you led off with for the show in regards of how we go about it. I don't, we can talk about how do I go about winning. It's in my opinion, it's really just how do I play well, right? How do I play well? And in most cases, outside of some circumstances with dice and whatnot, you can have a tendency to win and do well that way. And so the preparation piece also with the opportunity, you have to be able to recognize the opportunity. You have to know what you're looking at. And some of that takes understanding not just your army, but your opponent's army, as well as the terrain and everything that's available, as well as the timing, right? Just like you mentioned, the timing that goes into it. And so that's a lot to encompass within opportunity. And then when you get to preparation and your own understanding of what you have available and how you're going about it and how you've played out between practicing the missions, understanding any changes to format, because we will acknowledge that some of the different events have different terrain formats and how that plays into it. And so taking those two things and putting it together, I think you could get pretty lucky, Adam, if you just did that. That's all you
Pretty
have to do.
lucky. Oh yeah. That's all you got to do, guys. But yeah. So yeah, we won't. I guess that's the end of the topic, right? It's just get lucky, be lucky. It doesn't even matter.
Just, look, be in the right place. I like what you mentioned, though, is focus on the scoreboard. And that is one of the things when we're commentating on games is when it's clear, at least from our 50,000 foot view of not being at the table, it's clear that one player cannot really mount an offense against the opponent's army. And so attacking your opponent, not the thing you should be focusing on, maybe be a distraction at that point. You need to figure out how to attack the scoreboard. And that may mean picking certain engagements on the table, may just be being on the table in certain places. You've got some agency in that, when you picked it, but, it goes back to the primary and then what you pick for your secondaries. But yeah, at some point in time, realizing when it's time to simply focus on the scoreboard and less about what your opponent's army is doing to you.
But that
Yeah.
I think there's a strong balance between that, and I mean right in line with what you're saying, Paul. That there's the mission format, and knowing what your army can do in that given mission versus what the opponents can do, and how you focus or play into that is huge. and really being able to work that out or line it up to say, I'm going to be weaker at this mission, and so I'm going to need to change my priority of play to do this versus that. My army is good to do this versus that kind of deal. There's some armies that do play better into having fewer objectives and being able to control those objectives and hold it down or fight through them or what have you, where there's others that are going to have the flexibility or mobility to essentially take over those other objectives, or they can control the pacing of the fight. Like what you mentioned, Adam, I think with the Necrons, they really do have a solid advantage in the momentum of the fight, because if they can get up quickly using the Necron trait to move 6 inches up the board, right, the entire army, they're just that much closer to getting onto objectives and holding it down. And then they can choose by time over the rounds how they're going to control which objectives where, depending on how they pushed forward from the get-go.
Yeah, exactly right. And I suppose it might be a comparison that people at home could, I guess, have some correlations with. But in Magic the Gathering, there's considered to be a couple of different styles of decks you can build. You can build a control deck, you can build an aggro deck, you can build a tempo deck, or you can build just a pile of whatever cards, value cards you like. It really feels like Votann is just a supreme value pile of units, as in all their units are just like the best of
every
their
mythic
type.
is in the deck, and whatever.
It's just it's perfect. Yeah, it's just stacked with mythics, and yeah, just four ofs, best in slots, like the best enchantment in the game. It's in Votann. The best battle tank in the game is the Land Fortress, etc., etc. You take your max that you can take of them. Whereas Necrons, to Red's point, they're like the premium tempo deck. Like, they are just going to play tempo at such a speed, and then you have stuff like that's there to just table you as an aggro deck. And so if that's easy for people to come to grips with, or if that's a concept that is familiar to people, that's something you can attach to as well. But for my mind, the biggest thing I decide upon when I'm evaluating a matchup, like I rock up to a table at a tournament, is usually it's whether or not I'm going to fight over the primary or over the secondaries. Like, which of these two bits which one of these two columns do I want to be larger than my opponent's one? And then the one that I want to be larger than my opponent's one, I go about making sure the other one stays about the same. And the easiest way to extrapolate that, I guess, is playing the primary. So if I want to just go tit for tat with my opponent on the primary and win via the secondaries, because I think my armies, or I think I've chosen better secondaries than my opponent.
When you say tit for tat, you want to match them on score. If you're both playing for 8 or whatever, figure out what they're achieving, and then at least match that without overextending.
Exactly, and perfectly right. You said the 8s. The 8s is the magic word, because you can try and make them have 4s on their primary. You can try and stop them getting 12s, but the magic point to do is that they can get no more than 8. Your opponent's allowed to get less than 8. They're not allowed to get more than 8 on their primary score, because all of a sudden that's starting to run away from you. And this plays differently depending if you're going first or you're going second, because of course if you're going second you have the bottom of turn ability that if they do get a 12, you can match it with your own bottom of turn 5 12, or vice versa, if you're going first. But it's really the primary is where I think the overwhelming majorities of games are won and lost. And then as things get tighter and tighter, as in when players get to a similar skill level, as in like you're playing somebody who's as good as you or better, usually it becomes, I feel like, at least over the hundreds of games I watch, I commentate, I feel like the secondaries shine more when it's equal level opponents, equal level armies.
I'm picking that up. So let's talk about this, and also terrain. Can't mention it enough that you should probably have a lot of terrain on your table. And
I want to. Go ahead. Sorry.
I was about to lead Reds right into this. What were we saying just before we started?
I think that terrain, and I know like people talk about the mini game of player plays terrain and how it goes into it. There's a whole aspect to that, but I think that, and I've always been a fan of terrain, not just any terrain, but a lot of terrain. And if you rewind and you go, over the last several years, I've always been a fan of putting more terrain on the table. If there were ways that we could work out with the rules to make it so that it was easier for some models to move through it, around it, what have you, like I think that there's probably something to be had, but that's wish listing. Really, it goes back to when we first got into 9th edition. I was thinking like at minimum, a minimum terrain table would be probably around 12 to 14 pieces. And I was of the mindset of seeing how the mechanics that 9th edition was. I mean, y'all back me up here. Tell me if I'm armchair quarterbacking myself, but I was pretty confident that I've been on this position that terrain is such a significant factor from just ninth edition and arguably going back, I would say even really 7th edition with a lot of what they had, but in forward to now, that like I think a good terrain, table number quantity is probably around like 16. And I know that seems like a lot. Everybody's like stutter stop.
Pieces of terrain you're talking about.
Absolutely. And that, to be fair, that I'm thinking of like 2 to 4 forests. And they don't have to be big, right? Because it really, the nice thing about forests is that as long as your line of sight passes through it, it gives you the -1 to hit modifier, right? And so it doesn't have to be that big. It just has to be longer to a certain extent. And then we also, how many times have you seen barricades in a fight?
Yeah.
Anybody?
Have not. Yeah.
Have not. So, okay, I just said, if I said 16 and 4 of them are these smaller forests, and then I said that, 2 to 4 of them are barricades, what you want is you do want linear danger areas, right? You do want kill zones in the setup. And I think it's okay to have open spaces here or there, but it needs to be dynamic enough that it's creating dilemmas for players to maneuver. At no point should you just be able to like walk in and just absolutely wipe everything off in one go. You should have to fight through the terrain. And the only way to do that is to have this dynamic composition of terrain that requires you to push through it. And Tanya, you can speak to, and we've talked some about it with Age of Sigmar, and how terrain isn't as much of a factor, right? It's just not.
I think partly is that there's not a lot of shooting heavy factions in the game, and the ones that do exist tend to be quite fast and maneuverable. But yeah, in terms of the rules, the terrain rules don't really add that much to the game, unfortunately.
No, and that's okay. I think that's okay because it's the gameplay, the mechanic stage of Sigmar, I don't think incline themselves towards needing it. Whereas with 40k, as I've said before, like I almost don't think ranges are even necessary in some cases because most things can just shoot anyways, right? It doesn't seem to make a huge difference, but there are. And so, but still, given that, I do think the fact that you can shoot, you can reach out and touch someone with bullets of whatever manner, you need to have the terrain to be able to break the board into these pieces, these lanes of engagement that alter how you can or can't engage with ranged weaponry. And so I think it's a huge thing. And I think that with the armies and as they're coming out, you could see a drastic, or you could, I'm not saying you will, but you could see a more drastic development of terrain in the battle and see what that would do to the game. Because that's really, we talked about agency and some of the levers. And I think that TOs have a just as much a part as the players in making sure that they provide a game that keeps people engaged and interested in going forward. And the development of terrain could very well be one of those levers.
It really seemed to be the thing that Games Workshop learned the most coming out of 8th edition into 9th edition. Like that was the fundamental change, because the kind of way we play 8th edition and 9th edition is relatively similar, with the differences in mission play being probably the second biggest change, apart from the need for terrain. And I think that was really highlighted, especially when Iron Hands came out last edition. We were like, oh no, we need a lot more now. We just need to just proliferate terrain across these tables. And once we did, it became a great balancing factor. Like if you have a oppressive fire base, well, good for you. You can't see anything. It looks like all your guns are useless. And it became a way
you still have to play the game.
Phase.
You got to maneuver and get in position to
Exactly.
get your guns, and you got to bait me out kind of thing. You're back into a game.
100%.
Exactly what Red said, and I think I'm extrapolating this from Red is saying and taking it to kind of an end argument, in that I think all tabletop miniatures games are at their best when the movement phase is the most important phase. And when it is the most important phase, you see so much more engaging play. You see so much more interesting and nuanced pieces of play, and matchups become so much more technical. When it's literally just a shooting gallery, it's just who goes first wins, or who spikes first on their averages wins, and et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, with you get with determining lines of sight, the lanes. Look at the format of how other events do it. But I also want to bring up the fact that, we're kind of saying it'd be cool if you had all this other stuff, but there is sometimes a cost to that is not necessarily something that everyone can just manufacture. And
100%.
in your
That's
home
true.
games, though, I mean, put up a roll of paper towels.
Well,
Man,
and
I used to have baked beans for silos and stuff, and take them out of the pantry, chuck them on the kitchen table, just play some 40k.
but in a controversial opinion of mine, I know, and I absolutely acknowledge the other side of this. What I'm about to go into is I get why there are standardized tables. And I also, there's some middle ways to go about it of having series of tables or having different setups. And I've liked where at LVO, different tables or different missions, they've almost plotted out different terrain setups. Games Workshop and the cards, I think it's great. Like, I think that there's some really ways to lean into it and take advantage of that. I too, again, maybe I take it to an extreme, but I really like dynamic narrative tables with that. Not everybody gets the same deal. I'm okay with that. Again, there is degrees of luck. I mean, we talk about your matchups and who you run into, right? The opportunities associated with it. When I say it's luck, it's not a matter of just blind luck. It's that there are this many factions out there and you are better or worse against those factions in certain setups. And then you're prepared to play against them in such a way. And then you're prepared to fight through the terrain, right? One way or the other. And just because not everybody has the same setup, like it still makes for a game. It still tests your skill set. I'm sorry. Like, we've talked about how the game is not chess, right? We don't all have the same pieces. We don't all have the same. Do we have to all have the same board? Do we all have to be playing off that?
I mean, suspending disbelief for a moment, it's pretty funny that you'd see essentially two generals looking at a field of battle and being like, this field is exactly equal. We should fight here. And they both make the same assumption and agree to it, being like, this guy's going to kick my ass in a fair fight. I should totally get a hill or have my back against, or, against something, or have something to hold my right flank, left flank,
You want the
and then
high
they're like,
ground. Is the great movie
even is what we're after. Napoleon's looking at being like, 100% even. I like the looks of that. Said no like great general ever.
Yeah, exactly. And so that takes me, I hate that I've had to miss the last couple weeks and everything, but one of the times that I was out, I was actually like legit playing through a real world war game, right? And every single thing that we did was trying to ensure that we were not fighting a fair fight. Everything that we did was trying to leverage some advantage and ensure that we were disadvantaging the opponent by doing that. And it was all about making sure that we were overwhelming in one factor or another, not just like mass, not just how we did economy of force here or there. It wasn't just one given principle. It was how we took everything we could to tip the scale in our favor so that they didn't even have a chance if we could help it. And there's something to that, right? When we talk about war games, and all that goes into it, ultimately we are playing a community game, and we are playing something where we do want a challenge between the two, where we can both, shake hands beforehand, shake hands afterwards. Whereas the war game that I was doing, I don't necessarily need anybody to be there after the fact, if that makes sense. Yeah. And so, like, it's a totally different approach, because really going into Warhammer 40k, I want to have the person I played against, I want to play against them again and again and again and again. That's the whole scope.
Grind them into paste.
And be friendly about it the whole time.
Well, what's funny there is that getting into the psychology of the standard wargamer, and this is just my best extrapolation over a decade or so. We all want to be the person at the slight disadvantage who overcomes it and wins. That's the ideal tale of every wargamer walking away from the game. We played against somebody who was a little bit better than us. We played against an army that was a little bit better than ours. We went
on the bad side of the
to
terrain.
go first.
I didn't get a piece
exactly.
of cover.
We all want that narrative of we came from. I don't want to be the guy who came from way behind and won, because that probably means an aberration of dice occurred or a massive misplay.
I'll take an aberration of dice. I'm cool with that. I'm not going to be too proud to accept.
At the same time, I'll take it. In a 6-round event, like on second game on day 2, and I just got a horrible mismatch where I go first and win. I'll usually take it, but at the same time, the ultimate expression of what I love about this game is that narrative is that I was a little bit down, the chips were down, I made a great move, overcame the odds, and managed to get a slight win against a great opponent. That's the pinnacle of what I want from my 40k experience.
Yeah, that sounds good. And yeah, look, in this terrain again, if you're finding that something is happening, either you're getting shot too much or whatever. And what's too much? Who's to say? You're not, and I'll tell you where that line is. I actually have an idea where the line is. If you're not having fun, you might be able to include some additional things like a piece of your terrain.
Absolutely.
Your fun. That's too much. If you're not having fun, it's too much.
Even further than that, I think there should be like a minimum percentage of an army that should be able to be hidden in a deployment zone during deployment. Like, I think there should be the ability to hide X percent of your army. Not saying like knights and etc. etc. I'm saying like a well-rounded all-comers army should be able to hide most of their good stuff. You know,
with that, with having certain percentages of the terrain or the field being covered by obscuring terrain, things with the obscuring trait probably covers that. And whether it's player placed or set terrain or whatever, again, this is one of those things that if you're playing in a one-off game, you kind of get to have those rules. Like, hey, you get 2 pieces of terrain. They can be in this section of the board. I get 2 pieces, two of the big pieces or whatever, and then we build something that we're going to enjoy doing for the next 2 or 3 hours.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, there's a whole aspect to that, and I think Adam, what you're describing, fog of war, right? Like that's the whole thing. The opponent shouldn't always have the opportunity to just know where anything is, which is where I go back to when I know it hasn't played out necessarily as well as even I would have hoped. But like Gene Stealer Cult really does have these mechanics that we just haven't really got to see play out fully in the competitive environment. But they do have a fog of war notion with the blips, right? And then they have the crossfire capability, and they have all these cool little things that play into it. And I think that there's more, and the game continues to show us through different aspects how it can do things like that. And I do think that it's, I don't know if you've had a chance to see some of like the open war cards and things like that. I think it's really cool in how, we started this by talking about the fundamentals and talking about objectives and things like that. The open war cards at the deck, at least the deck I remember that was at the beginning of 9th edition, it had essentially like underdog rules that if you showed up with less points than your opponent, you essentially got new objectives that you could keep secret from your opponent. And if you were able to achieve them, you actually it was almost, like you're just getting more. You could get more points or whatever for doing that, for being under the value. And so there's some pretty remarkable things that you could do like that I think maybe, I know the competitive environment wants to streamline things, wants to keep it by making it standardized. It helps bring a degree of fairness. But then, like, when you make that argument, you also realize that there's like 15 plus factions. There's clear codex creep, right, over time and everything. It's almost like, man, why are we so bent on trying to standardize even those things when we could really just embrace all these different factors and then kind of see where people fall into it to a certain extent, right? I mean, we've talked about comp, we've talked about Highlander, we've talked about all these different things. If you're going back to, if you're having a good time and the community feels like they're all being engaged across these different comps, like what's to say that's the wrong way versus the mass standardization?
Yeah, I think there is no wrong way, as long as, again, you're having fun with whatever your play group is, but also with the healthy understanding that if you're going into an organized play environment, you've got to accept it, or know that you're going to play a certain way or have to do a certain thing. Maybe you have to take certain army choices, that you wouldn't take in a normal game. Those are just things you kind of got to get your mind in the right spot. Let's take a quick break, and then we will come back. We'll maybe close out this topic on terrain and then talk about scoring points on the primaries, like how to focus on attacking that scoreboard.
Kill it.
See you in a minute.
FTN is brought to you by Discount Games Inc. Please visit them at www.discountgamesinc.com. And don't forget to ask Jay about ways to save even more on your hobby projects.
We are back. Thanks for playing along with this last episode with the Judgment Tokens. I hope everybody's doing all right with your permanent...
I hope everybody's maintaining their Judgment Tokens, taking them, I've got to go to the bank, make sure you pick your Judgment Tokens off the desk, put them in your pocket, take them to the bank with you, bring them home, go to work, in the shower, You got to have a little spot set aside for your judgment tokens. Yeah, at all times.
And we
You
kind
could
of
make them into like a little necklace and wear it like the albatross.
Yes. Yeah.
we went a little bit off the rails in the last segment because we're going to talk about how to attack that scoreboard because we've all seen it, we've all played enough games to where we know that you could be in what you might consider a bad matchup or outstatted, but you can still also focus on the how you're achieving your points in the game. And we talk a lot about secondary choices, and that matters. And then also equipping your army to where you can take secondary choices. If you're playing against an army that needs to shoot a lot and they don't have any psychers, then your one psycher with a cleverly placed piece of terrain in the center of the table might score you a fair amount of points over the course of the game.
Absolutely.
Because you got secondaries.
Yep. And I think we have been pretty ubiquitous across the board in saying that at all times, if you're building a medium level competent army, competitive army even, you should have at least 2 or 3 secondaries locked in at list construction, saying my list is built to do this one, and then I'll see what I'm against and pick my third.
Yeah, you got a good shot.
Yeah, exactly right. You're like, well, this one's going to give me a good, this is one thing that has changed from competitive packet to competitive packet. Nockman to Nephilim to whatever comes next. It really has changed the value scale of the secondary objectives. And how good some are versus some others. But from my mind, Nephilim has taken the top score of a lot of secondaries down. Now it's perfectly acceptable for my best choice of secondary to get me between 12 and 14 points. It used to be your first choice of secondary had to get you 15 or it wasn't worth taking. And now I think your first choice, perfectly acceptable, 12 to 14. Second choice, 10 to 12. Third choice, 8 to 10. 6 to 10 even in a pinch if you're built in a certain way. Those are perfectly acceptable metrics to have as your secondary choices. And yeah, it's just up to you if you've built for purpose in such a way that you have a couple of good choices. Tyranids is a perfect example of this. People just saying that Tyranids are woefully bad because they don't have good faction secondaries. But the fact of the matter is they have very good secondary game because the small pool of 5 or 6 that they can take are very reliable because they can be built to have such a good psychic phase that they have almost an unconquerable, even versus T-Suns and Grey Knights. I've seen them getting 15s on psychic interrogation and ritual.
Wow.
I've seen them, dominating the primary score, and by dominating the primary score a bunch of behind enemy lines, a bunch of occasional fronts, things of that nature. And despite not having a huge swathe of options, the ones they have are all score between the 8 and the 12 mark. Which, if you remember what I just said about 12 to 14, 8 to 12, and whatever, getting like 10 on all 3 is pretty close to what everyone else is getting right now anyway. None of them get you a 15, but if they all get you, 8 to 12, that's perfectly fine. And if you're winning, and then the Tyranid player looks at the table and was like, well, I win the primary, we go about same for same, maybe a couple more on the secondaries, but I smash you by 20 on the primary, it looks like I won by 20 points. That's their game at the moment. And it's still, by all stats and representation, the best army in the game.
It's a good game, yeah.
That was a lot of information. Sorry.
Well, let's break it down a little bit. How do you evaluate a secondary to see if you can get those 8 to 12 points out of it?
I'm really not good at picking secondaries, so I'm just going to listen and hopefully learn something.
But I think that goes back to it's really we've all emphasized and underlined that, and I think Tanya, the struggle for some of these secondaries is you can watch what other people have done, right? And we can see, but at the same time, just because you see what they pick doesn't necessarily mean with the variation of who they're playing against or what have you, that's the same ones that you should take all the time. And that's what kind of, it's interesting because if there's anything that's really adapted to certain extents with the different seasons, it's been secondaries. Some of the primaries have adjusted here or there to one degree or another, but it's really interesting. When would you say, secondaries were in 8th edition, right? Mm-hmm. And then before that, we had kind of the ITC secondaries and the Nova secondaries and all that. And I think that it's always been this kind of building learning curve, and the seasons have added in, and we kind of talked about it between the break. And I think it's a really good point, Tanya, that it can cause some fatigue for players having to work through new secondaries and how that applies to your army versus the other person's army and this whole other aspect. It's like, we talk about all these mechanics and we talk about how things are going and how new codexes improve it or change it, but then look at how that was a lever for Necrons, for example, or Sisters, by providing these suddenly pretty stout secondaries that I think for Necrons, I mean, all of the Necron secondaries are pretty good, in my opinion, in different ways that you apply it. But for some others, it's not. And you wouldn't know that unless you really took them out and got to experience them or try them out yourself. Some of them you can look at and you'd be like, oh yeah, that's a really good secondary. Others, it's kind of harder to see until you go through it. And you can see where they're trying to get the army to play a certain way or what have you. And sometimes that's frustrating for people. Adam, you mentioned like the magic decks and everything and trying to score points based on what style of army that you're bringing versus how it goes. And that, I'd say it has a lot to do with it. It's a difficult part of preparation that's going to continue to change. I don't think that that's going to stop in competitive play. I think that secondaries will remain this ever adapting, evolving system for the time being until maybe a new edition changes that function entirely.
Let me break down a secondary. This is a somewhat basic one about how one might engineer a list to achieve it. So, Spread the Sickness is an updated secondary in the Nephilim book for the Death Guard. 1 Death Guard infantry. So those are 2 keyword, well, 3 words, but 2 keywords there that, of course, you have to pay attention to. So if you want to use this, you got to have some infantry. You got to be playing Death Guard, which you probably already are playing Death Guard, but you see where I'm going here. Unit from your army can start to perform this action at the end of your movement phase if it's within range of an objective marker you control that has not been contaminated by your army. The action is completed at the end of your turn. If completed, if the unit that performed the action has the objective secured ability, that objective marker is said to have been contaminated by your army. So you need objective secured. Not too hard to come by in the Death Guard book there with what you might be taking, but those are still considerations that you have to keep in mind. Otherwise, roll 1d6 on a 4+, the objective marker is said to have been contaminated by your army.
So in saying that, there's a couple of qualifiers there and a couple of things that tells you how you want to build your army. So a lot of the Death Guard builds at the moment have big blocks of 10 Plague Marines. They're kitted out with all the bells and whistles. Now, you don't want that unit taking a turn off to go sit in your battlefield, not shoot, not move up or be aggressive or spread influence or create issues for your opponent. You don't want that sitting there just doing an objective if you don't have to. So you want to take something that you don't mind doing nothing, or for possibly a turn or 2. It could be stringing out and doing the same thing on a different objective the next turn and the next turn, etc. So it informs where you want to go with your list. If you plan to take this, you need to plan to have a unit or 2 that is not fundamental to your game plan around to score you these points. Has to be OPSEC if you want to maximize the best potential of the objective, and so therefore it has to come from your troops choices. So you look at your troops choices. What are the one that's most fit for purpose to make this secondary go?
Going on to that, score 3 points each time an objective marker is in your deployment zone, contained by your army, and 4 points for each time an objective not in your deployment zone is. So you've got to, now you're creating all these things that you could build into your list to give you the best opportunity to score those points. And one of those things being, how do I get out of my deployment zone?
Yeah, exactly right.
And maybe that costs 2 turns.
Yeah, another great example is the change to retrieve Nephilim data. So in previous iterations of retrieve Nockman data or whatever it was before, your squad size didn't matter, and none of that stuff really mattered. You didn't have to roll the dice. You just had to have a unit get within a table quarter, do an action, you get X amount of points. Now there's a rider there saying you have to roll a d6 in order to see if you retrieve the data. If you roll a certain dice number, you retrieve the data with pluses and negatives depending on if you are. I can't remember if it's a troops choice or OPSEC. But you get +1 for one of those riders, and therefore if you have 5 guys and they're a troop sort or OPSEC, they automatically get it off. Otherwise, you need 6 to guarantee you do it. And therefore, we've seen this little metagame of people taking 6 Raptors, 6-man assault Marines, 6 of all these different non-troop choice options in order to make sure they get this Nephilim job. They take 1 or 2 squads of these. They're going out of their way
and to have it as an option.
Take a squad. Exactly, just to have it as an option in the missions where they need it.
The thing that I like about this, and I would look at this particular secondary and I would say, well, this is a good secondary because this is something I can do while playing the primary mission.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
right? So sometimes when I'm making lists, I sort of, and I don't know if this is right or not, right? Because I'm still kind of a new player, but I look at the secondaries and I think, well, if this is counter to me playing the primary mission, this might not be a good secondary for me.
Especially if you feel like you're going into a matchup outgunned. You're now you're not getting double duty out of what you've got on the table.
Well, as a guard player, I feel like everything outguns me.
Well,
Yeah,
I'm not salty about it at all, okay?
I like where you're going though is playing into what you can accomplish. And that's, what I wanted to focus on this is like what are the things that you can still be focused on, even if you're having that ritual that we all go through of putting your models back in the box a little more quickly than you think you should be.
I mean, so that is probably the lesson that I learned early on while playing a very underpowered army is you always have to sort of take a step back and just look at where you can get points. Like, even if you know you're outgunned, it's an uphill climb, you're probably not winning this one. Like, you can still do what you can do, and keeping your mind on the task at hand of getting those points really does stop you from getting tilted.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, that's exactly a great point. It's a great psychological thing you can use to your advantage in gaining some resilience on the table when you're losing, is just generating points. Everything feels okay if you're generating points. It's when you hit that brick wall and start getting a couple of donuts, the wheels really start to come off.
That is the worst. When you go a turn, is like, well, I guess I got 4 in the primary because you just couldn't get to my home field objective.
Yeah.
I never concede unless I've played it out well in my head and I cannot get any more points. Once I know I just don't have enough resources to get even one more point, that is the only time at which I'd be like, hey man, like, can we talk it out?
Yeah, the talking it out bit is an interesting topic as well. There is a natural state of the game in which, like, you've been tabled and there is no more ability to impact the scoreboard, in which it does happen. It possibly might be happening in the next couple of months more often than not, depending on what you're playing into.
You can be tabled,
but
and
there are
still. It's not
absolutely you can, and that is a good feeling too. By the way, it's pretty good. You feel like you outplayed against, like, obviously probably against a stronger list when you get tabled and still win, or you win with like a handful of models left. It's pretty nice. Which is, funnily enough, is where a lot of Necron players reside at the moment. I've seen, cool, got to 100 points, table me at your leisure, sir. It doesn't matter. But yeah, it is a real thing, trying to figure out where to score your points and keep the points momentum, which is a big deal. I've seen a lot of top table games where the opponent will try and pick a turn in which to smother the opponent's score whilst just ticking over themselves. Like, cool, I'll get a 4 and an 8 and a 4 and an 8, and then you'll get a 0, and my 4 and an 8 will be enough because we are two generally equally matched opponents. So I just need to pick the right turn in which to smother your score and then beat you by a handful. Do you guys see this? Is this something that happens to you guys as well?
What do you mean by this smothering the score?
Well, so a lot of the time, I see it, and possibly you've seen this as well, Paul, commentary. You get to a top table. Neither player wants to take a big risk on their scoreboard. They just want to keep it ticking over. The 4s and the 8s on the primary. They're pretty steady, medium scoring objectives, and then usually it all comes down to which player picked the turn of commitment better. Like, which one picked the turn in which turn that game was going to be decided.
Yeah, play this way in team events too. Depending on what your position on the team is.
I mean, this might like have a bunch of real life, comparisons in modern warfare also. But it seems like the game of 40k, turn 1, turn 2, turn 3 for a lot of armies, positioning, trying to get a little bit ahead or trying not to fall behind, and then picking a turn of commitment in which there is a large investment of forces in which you want to break your opponent's back or smother their scoring ability at the minimum. Like, doesn't need to remove models as long as it takes away their scoring ability. Like, a lot of the time you see it happen where they don't go after their best models, they go after and try and kill their obsec. Just destroy all their scoring ability and remove their obsec from the game. And then, cool, if you get tabled, doesn't matter. I got a 12 or 2 in my last turn and win. Is that something you guys see? Because I see that as being a fundamental play style of the Nephilim packet at a minimum.
Sure. No, I totally agree. I think that, and it goes back to certain armies and how they play and how they commit. Because different armies commit differently, in my opinion, in how they get into it. And so, like between World Eaters and when you really commit the melee force, and I'd say that translates to some of the melee builds for like Necrons, for example, and then how you commit your forces otherwise. And so, like with the Necrons, there's some commitment aspects typically to when you use like the Veil of Darkness and you pick up a unit and put it on the other side of the field or something like that. And so I've really seen that whole aspect of what you're discussing in regards to like a mirror match when I was playing Necrons versus another Necron player. And we really knew that he had a more melee build, I had a more ranged build. And so how he committed was absolutely going to dictate in a lot of cases how I would commit because I have the range and where he was going to come in. Or if I had chosen to commit first, I gave him the option. Because I was going second. And so I moved away from him to allow him to try and commit earlier, which would allow what I would hope were some seams to allow me to do what I needed to do. But I didn't really see, there might have been some initial trade-offs. I really didn't see the advantage coming until the later in the game. And it took some real what we call tactical patience in order to wait out the tempo of the moment when he commits. And you see it with orc players too, right? It's a built-in mechanic that demonstrates their commitment when they wog. It is and even with Tau, Montka, or Kauyan, it's a form of commitment that they really lean into, and you can see where that's occurring. And so when they choose one of those things, you know that they're trying to play and take advantage of all that they can in just that moment. And then do you have the army that can actually endure, withstand, essentially take it on, and then still be able to play afterwards to whatever aspect? And so back to what you were talking about, Adam, of smothering aspect or what have you, it's really just the tide of it, right? It's a tempo and frequency thing. When I say frequency, I mean the amount of activity that occurs in a compressed amount of time or an extended amount of time. And so as the frequency, when it comes together, this is what you see as commitment. When you compress all of those actions into one, like the weight of it, that's commitment. And then as you spread it out over time, if you can actually manage effectively, which I think Necrons do well too, of being able to endure, because in a lot of the more objective or competitive builds, you have OBSEC, right? And I think custodians, the custodes could do this as well, right? That they could be hanging on and then in the end still be able to swing in and seize objectives and essentially deny you the ability to do that. And that was huge. It was a massive thing.
Back to the way we started this. I mean, Paul started this off talking about 5 and 6 objective missions. I find it a lot of the time, especially in 5 objective missions, I guess the crucible of battle is almost decided for you. You know, both players are going to try and hold 2 and then fight over 1. In 6 objective missions, it gets a lot different. But we might talk, is it cool if we talk about 5 objective missions? I just want you guys' opinions. How do you guys go upon contesting the middle objective in a 5 objective mission? Is there anything you guys do specifically? Like, do you just go, I'm going first, here's my biggest, meanest, baddest unit on the middle objective.
Let's see what you can do about it. 3 2+ save units that happen to fly. Let's just see how this works out. There. Sometimes it works out, sometimes it doesn't.
Yeah, what is the different philosophies there? Because I mean, that is the crux of the primary. Will be decided upon who holds that middle objective. Whether you're going to trade 8s, one player gets a 12 because they put their biggest and meanest there, and you swing and you miss, etc., or you don't want to commit because you think you'll be counter assaulted or whatnot. Because it does seem to be that's something that I see players struggle with. It's something I've struggled with as well. What is the right decision on a 5 objective mission?
I try to have at least one forward deploying unit in my army, something that can deploy outside of my deployment zone. And a lot of times, depending on the train setup, of course, you just don't want to sacrifice a unit and stick them there and, whatever. But I try to have a unit that's always in position to where I can put them on that objective or very near that objective so I can threaten it before my opponent does.
Yeah, and then you can threaten to be like, well, here's my unit on the objective, and if you don't commit something to remove it, I'm just going to get a 12 and sit, essentially. Play a non-committal game now that I'm up. That seems to be something I always think I should do, but I rarely pull it off, if that makes sense.
Is it because your opponents are just being able to overwhelm that, or do you... You like in turn 2, you're like, forget it, I need to be somewhere else. and walk off.
Yeah, I guess it depends what style list I've been playing. I've been playing playing Dark Angels is weird. I'm playing the two like absolute extremes at the moment. It's the oops, all everything in my army is transhuman, Deathwing, or it's the oops, everything's Ravenwing and super fast. So I get the kind of the pitfalls and upswings of both. But a lot of the time, my favorite thing to do in a 5 objective mission is to take a small unit that can get exponentially harder to kill through stratagems. And a perfect example would be like infiltrators or incursors, whichever one has smoke bombs, because you can put 5 guys, possibly with 6 I feel no pain from an apothecary that sneaks up behind them, or you daisy chain back, 1 CP for transhuman, 1 CP to drop a smoke bomb for -1 to hit, could be in cover, etc. And so it really challenges the commitment of your opponent, how much they can afford to put out to remove it, which then of course in the next turn you can hopefully have a chance to remove and there get up on some kind of trade war or tempo game. Is this ringing any bells for anybody?
No,
I don't have anything that's tough, so no, not ringing any bells for me.
Well, for guard, it would be chucking a chimera with 10 guys in it. I guess would be the closest thing you could do, because then you make them expose something that can remove a tank and something that can remove the infantry.
You got Bull Ogre.
And so at a minimum, it's
with
two
-1
things.
AP.
Been a proponent of throwing out Blade Guard and stuff in that same kind of mentality. Maybe not turn 1, or you would do it turn 1, but couldn't start there.
Yeah, you have to move. You have to, have a guaranteed move advance onto it. But or you could set up 2 or 3 options to do it and just see which one makes the advance roll. That's totally acceptable as well. And another, so very cheeky. But a lot of people like to use little units like I think Farseers are probably the best ones at doing this. It's a play for the psychic ritual that's non-committal. Like you shoot out a Farseer on a bike, Farseer Skyrunner. They do you use fate dice to do the psychic ritual in the middle, and then you use you from a position of undeniability, as in outside 24 inches from anything being able to deny them. You quicken the Farseer back to its starting position. So you scored your points without committing. Is this another style of play that rings a bell? Because that's to me is a fundamental play you can build into your list to take something that could be a risky play and turn it into a secondary
Remove
reliability.
Some of that risk. You know what your fate dice will be at the beginning of the turn, and most of the time you're going to get your powers off anyway. So
and exactly right. And psychic ritual is one that you only need to do 3 times. Now, in a 5-turn game, you can be pretty sure you're going to roll enough fate dice to get it off, 3 times.
I'm digging that. Seen that happen a bunch, on stream, and it is a very reliable way of getting points. And when you can feel like you're walking around with 12 to 15 points in your back pocket, that always feels good.
I feel so depressed. I just hear like all these options that other factions have, and I'm like, my poor guardsmen.
Guard
But
gets
Tanya,
their time.
it'll come. I agree. It's coming. But I mean, have you tried Gaunt's Ghost yet, Tanya?
No, but do you get like 10 victory points just for being cool?
Pretty close. They're pretty tough. They've held out pretty well. I've been really pleased with how they've played into it, and they are a unit that I feel pretty comfortable that I can send off to go accomplish things, because they also have the ability to move, shoot, conduct an action, and without it disrupting any of those things. And so they have been able to get out and do stuff that people just really don't see coming from this small little 6-man unit. So I've been pretty pleased with that in a lot of cases. I'm not saying it's like the best. I'm not saying, I did mention Codex Creep and everything else up front, and they've done some with the data slate. Is it enough? I mean, I talked about Necrons for a long time, and would I say that that is it enough for Necrons now where they are with the data slate? I mean, I'm not going to stop asking. I appreciate everything they've done, but yeah, it's pretty good. Yeah, Necron's pretty good. But so Guard, I mean, they're going to get it. I think they'll have a fair turn. I think that it's coming as we see some of these things like armor contempt for the tanks and 2+ armor saves and whatever else might play into it. Talking like what Adam was saying of having chimeras. I mean, imagine if armored personnel carriers were really equivalent to armored personnel carriers. I get that maybe Guard don't get or deserve armor of contempt, but I could see it on their vehicles. I could see that.
I don't want to get too far into speculation on what we may or may not see from. Just got to deal in the now, and I like it that we got the opportunity to talk about a 5 objective mission and kind of boil down that it comes to that game. Maybe decided how often you have been able to get your opponent not scoring that 12 on primary. And so you factor that into what your risk versus reward is.
Yeah.
And then also keep your secondary game strong and looking at your list and not stumbling into the secondaries and building your list directly geared toward how you're going to get points. Now, what you choose for a secondary may change because of who you're facing. I mean, you may come up and they may have just lined up. They're bringing down all day long. You're going to get basically like an easy 12 points or whatever on those. But take some of that risk out of it and keep the power in your hands as much as possible. And how you do that, read the whole the block of text for the things that you're probably going to try to take, and then make sure you have the stuff equipped in your list to do it.
Yeah. It's okay, Tanya. Our time will come. It'll come. It came for Necrons. It only took about 3 years, but it came.
I want it to be good.
It's been an arms race the whole time. The game has continued to escalate. Put some more terrain down. Give everybody a relatively fair shot with a new codex. We'll see how it goes. I think it'll be pretty exciting.
For the hobby segment, more of a cautionary tale to mention here is that I did a test model and then set it aside and then went to go paint some other models. And when I came back around to do the basing, I just thought that I'd done the basing a certain way on the other model. This is a very minor thing. I actually thought that I used Nuln Oil to wash the base down before I dry brushed it. But as soon as I put that first brush stroke of Nuln Oil on, I'm like, this looks a little dark. Like, I'm sure it's fine. And then
flood it.
Well, just finish it off. But then I remembered, like, oh crap, I did not use Nuln Oil on that test base. I used Basilicum Gray.
Oh, snap.
Yeah. So, I know we've talked about writing the recipe down in your book and keeping it close by so when it gets down to run it. Now, look, I just made some assumptions. I wasn't looking at any piece of paper or whatever. I just going off memory, trying to get it done, and then made the wrong decision. But I think being disciplined about logging that recipe someplace that you'll remember to look for it and then get it done. It was a very quick fix. Just went back in with some gray paint over the Nuln once it dried, and then dry brush it up like normal. No one will ever know about my mistake.
I would have just put extra flair on the base. Oh, shrubbery here, some rocks over here.
I do plan to go back with
some
snow effect on the base, because I think the gray and the snow and the yellow armor was cool. But anyway, that's a little cautionary tale. Figured I'd slip it in right here at the very end of the show. Don't get sloppy.
Write it down in your book.
Yeah, I've since written it down. We're not gonna, because I was with all these tutorials they've switched to using Basilicum Gray in the same way that kind of Nuln Oil was used before, and it's not the exact same. It doesn't even it doesn't look the same. I'm using the old Nuln Oil, and it's darker than Basilicum Gray, but you can definitely get some shade effects on there, and I liked it. It was the Astrogranite Debris, Basilicum Gray, and then dry brush Dawnstone, and where the gray color for the Basilicum Gray is pretty close to Eshin Gray. So if there's other, rocks or whatever on the base that come with the miniature, you can paint it Eshin Gray, and it matches the Astrogranite pretty well. And then
I like to make my rocks different colors for interest.
Oh yeah, mix it up however you want. I'm just saying that if you were to be caring about that, matching the paint to something that may be already on the miniature, you can do it with Eshin Gray. So when you put the Basilicum Gray on there, it gives you a nice effect, and then dry brush it with the Dawnstone, or even a lighter gray color, maybe even some bone color. Looks real good in depth and deep on the base. Nice little quick basing tutorial. Don't do like I did and forget what your recipe on your test model was.
I want to know if anybody actually used my idea of getting like an actual sketchbook that you can actually paint in.
That's a great idea. Like a multimedia sketchbook, yep.
Because then you can mix all your colors and you can I want to know in the comments. If you did it, if you tried it, let me know how it went in the comments.
Sweet. That's our show this week. Brad, good to have you back. Adam, I just had to drop for a second.
Glad to be back.
It's during the day over here, or over there on his side. And Tanya, it's been a pleasure. We'll see y'all next week.
See ya.
Bye, everybody.
I don't know what they said, but I already subscribed. You better do it too.